today's Ethnic Media Services weekly national briefing. I'm Pilar Marrero, your moderator for today. Today, we are going to discuss what's next for education under a Trump presidency, which, as you know, starts January 20th. The American education system is poised to become a battleground for significant changes under the new president and his allies. There is a campaign promise to cut the Department of Education, which may or may not be politically viable. But other plans may include targeting federal funding to schools as punishment for example, the use of inclusive instructional materials or diversity programs. Pushing choice or vouchers to benefit private institutions is another goal of the incoming administration. Experts also believe that the power of the federal purse and the accreditation system may be used to push higher education institutions to dismantle diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. And the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights could be used to preserve the rights of white students. Colleges and universities might also suffer a possible exodus of students due to restrictive new immigration policies, causing further financial challenges. We are honored to host a stellar panel today. Our speakers are Pedro Noguera, Dean of the USC Rosier School of Education; Thomas Talk, Director of Future Ed, Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy; and Thomas A. Sáenz, President and General Counsel of MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund. We ask panelists to speak slowly for our interpreters in Spanish, Korean, and Mandarin. We ask reporters to enter questions in the chat, and we ask our speakers, if they can, to answer questions in the chat when they have a moment. We will send a video of today's briefing and expanded bios with contact information for each speaker to all participants later today. And so let's start with our first speaker. Pedro Noguera is the Dean of the University of Southern California Rosier School of Education. Welcome, Dean Noguera. I will ask you a really broad question, and you can take it on from there. You have 10 minutes to talk about anything you want. And I guess the big question here is, what do you expect from the Trump administration regarding education in general, basic, secondary, higher, national policy? And also, if you can, please talk a little bit about potential impact in our state of California in particular, maybe at the end. We're so happy to have you with us.
Thank you, Pilar. And good morning from Los Angeles to all of you out there. It's a pleasure to be with you. Let me start by saying no one knows. No one knows what's next because no one knows what's going to happen. The events of the world keep changing so quickly and in ways that many of us can't even imagine or predict, that to try to say we can expect this to happen is, I think, foolish. So let me start with that. Having said that, let me say that given what Trump has said he wants to do, and given who he's appointed, Linda McMahon, to lead the U.S. Department of Education, my short answer is get ready to rumble. Now, those of you who know that Linda McMahon used to be with the World Wrestling Federation, and that's how they would start their matches, is get ready to rumble, will know what the reference is. I'm using it to say that we can expect lots of resistance and conflict if they try to proceed with plans to dismantle the Department of Education. And it will come from unlikely quarters, and those are from other Republicans, both in Congress, the Senate, and in the country, in rural areas. And let me explain why. I don't typically defend bureaucracies, whether they be federal or state or local, because very often they create more trouble, particularly in education, than schools or universities need or deserve. However, the U.S. Department of Education plays a critical role in delivering resources to schools. Here, I'm particularly referring to Title I, which brings supplemental resources to schools serving impoverished children across the country, which was created as a part of civil rights legislation in the 1960s, and then also Pell Grants, which support low-income students in going to college. Both of those are highly popular, essential programs. And while the administration has not said they want to dismantle or destroy those, getting rid of the Department of Education could jeopardize oversight. And I'm not sure if Congress will just go along with this unless they have a clear plan on how to do this. I question whether or not they have a clear plan. I think that a lot of what is driving the administration right now is ideology, an ideology that first and foremost is aimed at launching and sustaining these culture wars. So I think we'll see a lot of attacks on DEI, a lot of attacks on the rights of transgendered students. And incidentally, they need the Office of Civil Rights to carry out those attacks. So that's in the Department of Education right now, at least. So it's ironic that they would get rid of the, unless they just place it someplace else, because they'll probably want those tools to wage those culture wars. But beyond the culture wars, if they really try to push choice and vouchers, they're going to experience much more resistance than I think they have expected. In the last election, while most of the election was focused on the presidential race, 3 states, 2 Republican, Kentucky and Nebraska, and 1 purple, Colorado, voted down unanimously voucher initiatives. I think it's important to keep that in mind. The public has shown repeatedly a distaste for voucher initiatives, which do, like we've seen now in Arizona, often result in subsidizing affluent families at the expense of poor families and taking money out of the public school system. And when given a chance to vote on these measures, the public has consistently voted them down. And we've seen that in many states, as I said, both Democratic and Republican. So if that's what they want to do, I think they're going to run into considerable resistance. If they have ideas about efficiency, which apparently Elon Musk and Vivek say they do, by all means, let's see more efficiency. Again, I don't think we should try to defend a bureaucracy. And much of what the Department of Education does is regulatory. So there's room for greater efficiency. There's room for, I think, making sure that federal monies are spent appropriately. And I think the Biden administration, while they should be applauded for getting money out under COVID relief, should be criticized for not making sure that those monies were spent according to the needs. I want to point out that while this plays out in Washington, the country is still faced with huge educational challenges. We have huge gaps in achievement that were exacerbated by the pandemic, particularly in math. And we also have major challenges that are related to teaching kids to read, the fact that many Americans don't understand science, and the threat of climate change. What's really clear is that civics education, a basic fundamental knowledge of how the Constitution works, about how government should work, is lacking for many Americans. So our educational system, K-12, has great needs. And it's unfortunate if all the attention goes into the politics and not into the substance of education. I do think that higher education is in need of reform and change, because I think higher education is too expensive in this country. And right now we're facing a situation where there's going to be declining enrollment, which will affect colleges and universities across the country. It'll also affect public schools. And that's going to produce many changes that will lead to many institutions basically shutting down because they no longer have the students to be sustained. So there is a need for change. Whether or not the administration will play a role in supporting the changes that are needed is the question. Or will they instead merely disrupt and create chaos? My tendency is to think they'll do the latter. because I don't think they're coming in with a clear understanding of how the system works. I will say one more thing and then stop to see if there are questions. Trump is coming in as though he has a political mandate, even though this was a very close election. I want to remind the journalists out there, Ronald Reagan, in his second term, did in fact win a landslide. And he experienced more resistance than he ever experienced. I was involved in that resistance as a student at UC Berkeley in the anti-apartheid movement. Reagan's first defeat in Congress was a veto. He tried to veto sanctions against South Africa, and Congress overturned that veto. And it was the beginning of a switch in the tide for Reagan. And so often when politicians come in, believing they have more of a mandate than they actually do, they often make huge mistakes. And I have a feeling that this will happen with the Trump administration as well, particularly in education.
Thank you, Dean Noguera. There is one question in the chat, and I have a couple of other questions, but Henrietta Burrows, please go ahead with your question, please.
Thanks so much, Pilar. Would eliminating the Department of Education undermine the whole concept and survival of public education? Would it just bring on just an awful lot of chaos?
No, I mean, most of the funding for public education comes from the states, 90%. So the federal role is actually relatively minor, except in the area that I mentioned, in compensatory education, compensating for the effects of poverty in urban and rural districts, especially. But no, eliminating the Department of Education won't eliminate public education. It will generate a lot of conflicts. I'll give you another example, special education. The federal government plays a significant role in funding and oversight of special education through the Office of Civil Rights. And often they will play a role in ensuring that the needs of children with disabilities are in fact being met. Those children come from Republican households and Democratic households. So again, if they pull back on that oversight, they're going to find resistance and pushback coming from many quarters.
Thank you.
So you were talking about the need for changes in higher education. Can you give us an example of what changes you would like to see?
I think that, look, I think DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is to me, the country's getting more diverse. No matter what happens with Trump, even if they shut the border down, the country's getting more diverse. All you have to look at is who's having babies. Latinos having more babies than any other group in the country. And so diversity is our future. How our universities and institutions respond to growing diversity is essential, because if you maintain so much inequity as we have right now, you create resentment and conflict. And so universities have a responsibility to do something about it. At the same time, they also have to make sure that diversity of opinion in the way we think about things is reflected in who teaches and what students are taught. And I think universities, especially elite universities, are weak in this regard and need to be criticized and need to be pushed to be more inclusive and to be more representative of the range of beliefs and opinions in the country. So I think they're going to get pushed back. Now, we've already seen several states impose bans on books and other kinds of censorship, in my opinion, in this country. If they continue down that path, I think we will face, it'll be really unfortunate, because the only countries that promote censorship of that kind are authoritarian regimes. And I don't think Americans are ready for that yet.
Do you believe that the Trump administration will attempt to cut any kind of funding to education, be it federal grants, Pell funding, research funding? There's been a lot of talk about that.
I think they will want to, but again, they'll get pushback on that, because those grants go to, I'll give you an example, community schools. These are schools now that have been created to address the fact that a lot of our kids are hungry, kids that don't have health services, kids have basic needs that schools often must step up. Many Republican states have embraced this concept. West Virginia, Oklahoma are leaders in community schools. Preschool, which the federal government's not fond, with the Trump is not fond of. Preschool, Oklahoma is the leader in the nation in establishing preschool, universal preschool in the country. This is not a partisan issue, right? It cuts across. And so if they decide they want to cut back funding, again, they're going to experience resistance in Congress from Republicans.
One more thing. You talked about, you did a podcast, I think, on the big success of in education advancements in Compton locally. Do you see real gains like that in other local districts? And do you worry that they might get undermined by the new administration's efforts or measures?
I think what we're seeing in Compton is really encouraging. It's proof that you can, even when in conditions where there's concentrated poverty, produce schools that are more successful in meeting students' needs. Unfortunately, Compton is still an outlier. And we can look at communities not far away, like Inglewood, where you see the opposite. And Inglewood is a district that's falling apart, even though the state of California is in charge of Inglewood Public Schools. So that's a criticism for the state of California. I think the real question, but the federal government has not been a great ally in helping school districts like Compton anyway, under either Democrats or Republicans. So I don't think, it's interesting. When No Child Left Behind was adopted by the Bush administration in 2001, it was bipartisan. It was Democrats in the House and Senate and the Bush administration together who embraced the idea of accountability. Now, I was critical of many of the measures, but I was in agreement on the essential idea that there must be evidence that kids are learning in school, right? I haven't heard any mention of that idea coming from the Trump team. So it'll be interesting if they revive a focus on evidence of learning, which seems like a basic principle in education.
Dean Noguera, thank you so much. I was trying to get as many questions in as I could before, because I know you have to leave in a little bit.
I'll stay on for the next 12 minutes.
Yeah, and jump in if you want to say something, please.
I'll try not to.
Okay. No, yes, do this too. Okay, all right. Let's move on. And our second speaker is Thomas Talk, Director of Future Ed, Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy. He's a scholar, and he used to be a journalist, just like us. So he used to be our colleague. We welcome you and ask you to offer your view on the same thing, national policies that may affect education in our communities. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Pilar, and thank you, Pedro, for all your hard work over many years on behalf of civil rights in the U.S. I agree with Pedro that it's hard to know exactly what the Trump administration is going to do, but there are some signals that have emerged from his campaign, from his previous administration, and from some of the things that his surrogates and allies have been saying. I think it's worth noting that education is not the highest priority for the incoming president. Pedro sort of alluded to this when he suggested that it's unclear whether Mr. Trump is committed to improving public education, which is the sort of sector in the K-12 landscape that educates by far the largest percentage of students. Some 90% of students attend public schools, and so it is sort of hard to fathom in some ways his sort of extensive focus on everything but the quality of the nation's schools and improving opportunities and outcomes for the nation's students, in particular those who have traditionally fared least well in the nation's schools. But with that as background, I'd be happy to give you some sort of insights, perhaps some suggestions of what he might do in higher ed and K-12. Maybe starting with higher ed first. There has been talk about the administration trying to tax endowments, which is a little bit ironic because they're essentially going after a relatively small number of higher ed institutions, the elite ones with large endowments. Most higher ed institutions in the U.S. Of the 5,000 or 6,000 total institutions have very small or non-existent endowments. But that is a way of getting at some of the elite institutions and some of their priorities in recent years. In contrast, I think that the administration is likely to, again, as it did in the first Trump administration, to try to eliminate impediments, more appropriately called oversight and accountability, for the for-profit higher education sector. As we know, Mr. Trump himself was in that business until he was forced out of it through a consent decree that had him pay many millions of dollars to students who for fraudulently marketing his university. Trump U, as it was called. So the Biden administration, like the Obama administration before it, implemented a number of regulatory changes to make it, or sort of on behalf of students in the for-profit higher ed sector. And President Trump, in his first administration, undid those protections implemented by Obama. Biden put them back in, and we can expect to see those be watered down again. The FAFSA problem, the federal student aid application process that the Biden administration has done a very poor job of managing, ironically, given its commitment to increased access to higher education, will become a Trump administration issue. The problem has not been solved fully, and the Trump administration, which is while the president-elect has been very critical of the Biden administration's handling of the issue, will now own the issue himself. So keep an eye on that, because to Pedro's point, the federal funding plays an important role in enabling students who have traditionally been underrepresented in higher education, giving them the opportunity to attend 2 or 4 year school. So it's really an important issue. I do think that there will be pressure through the administration to reduce Pell Grant funding, to reduce AmeriCorps, to reduce federal work-study programs. Many Republicans have traditionally opposed those programs and have sought to lower funding, and so it will probably be in the Trump budget. Whether there is sufficient pushback of the sort that Pedro alluded to from Democrats on the one hand and self-interested Republicans on the other, I think remains to be seen. I think that the loan forgiveness initiatives that the Biden administration has initiated are going to end. I think that the administration is likely to use the Office of Civil Rights in the U.S. Department of Education or wherever else it might end up to narrow opportunities, protections, if you will, under Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972, which the Biden administration had extended to, among other things, support transgender students. Obviously, that's part and parcel of the incoming President Trump's sort of culture wars, if you will, culture sort of focus. And I think we can expect to see some action there only because he's made such a big deal of it. I think international students are at risk to a certain extent and should be somewhat nervous, given the administration's likely early work to limit access or immigration into the U.S. both legal and illegal. I think that's probably what they're going to do first out of the gate. Remember that the deputy chief of staff in the White House for policy is going to be Stephen Miller, who was Trump's immigration czar, if you will, and is a hardliner, very much of a hardliner on the issue. So that I think is going to be a challenge. I think Dreamers should be concerned as well, and affirmative action is likely to be a focus of the Civil Rights Office and the Ed Department as well. The president has been quite vocal in his support of the Supreme Court's ruling in the Harvard and University of North Carolina cases limiting ending affirmative action. So that's a bit of a laundry list, but those are some of the things that I think will be in play in higher ed. Again, it's a little bit unclear exactly how they will play out, but they will be in play, I think. K-12, Pilar, you mentioned at the outset private school choice. I can't imagine that there won't be a federal voucher or tax credit component to the likely tax bill that the administration is putting together, which will, along with immigration, I believe, be among its first priorities, probably in 2025 or early 2026. Remember that the first Trump administration sought to include a federal voucher program in its 2017 tax bill. It got stripped out. They reintroduced it 2 years later as a standalone bill. It did not pass, but I can't imagine that they're not going to promote it again. Pedro's right. There is some anxiety about private school choice, which under its most recent iteration in the states has been making public monies available to all students, regardless of the schools they came from or their families' income levels, which were sort of narrowing criteria for some of the early choice initiatives in this country, dating back to the about 30 years, 35 years. It seems to me that there will be legislation. I think it stands, frankly, I actually think it stands a good chance of passing this time, because there's such a groundswell of support in many red states, notwithstanding, as Pedro rightly pointed out, that there were defeats, and they were fairly resounding in 2 red states via the voters. There's just when you look at the state level policymakers, there's just a lot of support, and there's also being brought to bear a tremendous amount of pressure on Republican lawmakers, including in particular rural representatives who have traditionally been loath to support the use of public monies for private schooling because it undermines their local public schools, which are such important dimensions of their communities. I do think we're going to see that legislation. Whether it passes or not is unclear. I think there will be budget cuts or budget cuts proposed and/or block grants proposed, which combine various programs under a single funding to states to use as they would like. It's just, we can't forget that the Republicans now have control of the Senate, the House, and the White House, even though the congressional margins are pretty slim. So I think we'll see that again, and we'll see, proposals to cut funding and to block grant some of it. But again, it's unclear just actually how far it will go. Those are a few of the big ones. Again, as Pedro said, and Tom will probably say too, that the Civil Rights Office in the department is likely to become a promoter of opposition to diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and other sort of initiatives that have been promoted in the name of greater equity by Democrats. So Again, there's a lot going on there, but I think the resistance will come for sure. There'll be lots of lawsuits, but they're going to push on these issues, I think. I do think it's important to say to reporters, as a former reporter, that uh, to me, the most important way to cover this presidency, this administration, is through the lens of what's best for students, right? Uh, Always, or at least always keep that as a touchstone. How do we improve opportunities and outcomes for the students who have been least well served in the past in this country? And you know, you could argue that the debates over transgender rights and the like are part and parcel of that conversation, but I would argue the culture war battles and the budget cuts and all this, they miss the larger point, as Pedro said quite sort of clearly and accurately, that many of our students in this country are struggling academically, and they were before the pandemic made things even worse. Some 54% of students in this country read below the sixth grade, adults. Sorry, 54% of adults aged 16 to 74 in this country read below the sixth grade level, according to the U.S. Department of Education data. That's a striking statistic, and one that we can't afford to continue or leave unaddressed. Given the rapidly changing nature of work, given, as Pedro said, our changing demographics, and hence the need to educate to higher level students who traditionally were even largely left out of the nation's education equation. So there's a lot of work to do, and federal leadership does matter, even though the Constitution is silent on the issue of education, and therefore under the Constitution. Authority over the issue devolves to the states and then ultimately to school districts, the 13,000 school districts in this country. Federal leadership is critical, not only with the money it provides to students who have traditionally struggled, not only as a lever for equity, but also as a source of leadership. And I fear, as Pedro does, that we may not be getting the leadership that we really need on the school improvement front. And I'll stop there.
Okay, I was unmuting there. Thank you so much, Tom Talk. There was a lot packed in there. You mentioned a couple of issues, loan forgiveness. We know that has been a popular program. Why do you think the Trump administration might want to get rid of that?
Well, I don't like it. It is largely opposed to federal expending, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, that's a complicated issue because there is an argument to be made that people who take out loans should repay them, and is it fair for those who do repay their loans to have others be absolved of that responsibility? And so it's a controversial issue that they want to play to politically, but it's also a budgetary issue. They're also looking to, or in the first Trump administration, the first Trump administration sought to eliminate the loan forgiveness program sought to end the loan program for students who went into public service, like teachers, firefighters, and others. And that's just surprising to me on two levels. A, those folks are super important to the well-being of our communities on the one hand, and then secondly, a lot of them voted for Trump. So I don't know if he'll do that again this time.
Yeah. And we talked, and I mentioned in my intro, and you talked about choice and vouchers. For those of us who haven't covered this issue, can you explain what it is?
Sure. traditionally, tax dollars have been used to fund public schools at the K-12 level, elementary and secondary education. Going back 35 years now, there have been experiments with providing students, public school students, with public monies to attend private schools. Those early programs were focused largely on students who were in failing public schools or were from low-income families that couldn't afford private schooling on their own. And increasingly, uh, under with the support of under the advocacy of conservatives who believe in free markets, who in some cases have libertarian opposition to government involvement in their lives more generally, and who are opposed to public schools and see public schools as not serving well many students, these programs have expanded to include all students, regardless of their family income, as I said before, regardless of the schools they came from before. So in a dozen states now, these so-called universal private school choice programs are available or are being used by some 600,000 students. Many of them, as Pedro suggested, are they tend to be white students and more affluent students. Whereas the early school choice programs, which were created through sort of families get tax credits or they get government vouchers that they can spend in these different schools. Those early programs, again, were inhabited by or used mostly by low-income students, and disproportionately they were students of color. So we're seeing a shift, and it is a very controversial, very dramatic trend in this country.
Well, thank you. Please stay around, and if you can answer questions that you see in the chat, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, I'll try to.
Thank you so much. And let's bring in Thomas A. Science from Maldives. Tom, welcome. I would like to hear from you, as you know, about the civil rights challenges that you expect during this administration. You expect students, schools, and universities to face. If you have any expectations at all.
Sure. I know we're a little behind, but so I'll try to be brief. But I do think it's important to note, as my co-panelists have noted, that we don't know what the Trump administration will do. President Trump has a history, including in his first term, of promising all kinds of things and not actually delivering on those purported promises. I remind us all that if he had fulfilled one of his major promises, we would have a full wall at the border and it would have been paid for by Mexico. Didn't happen. And I think that that's true across the board, not just in education, but I want to emphasize what you hear right now from Trump and his advisors about immigration is overstated. It is overstated on purpose as a part of a scare campaign that is designed to drive what they call self-deportation. This is all so that sometime early in his term, within the first week, Donald Trump will announce that hundreds of thousands of people have left the country as a result of his being elected and his promised immigration enforcement. Of course, the number they will use will be a vast overstatement, but they are trying currently to drive as many quote unquote self-deportations as possible and are therefore dramatically overstating what it is possible for them to do both practically and legally in the realm of immigration enforcement. Specifically, I want to assure everyone that despite the talk that you may have heard, the decision in Plyler versus Doe, which is a 1982 U.S. Supreme Court decision guaranteeing every child the right to attend free public school from kindergarten through 12th grade, regardless of immigration status, that precedent, that court decision is not in any imminent danger at all. I know we have seen a Supreme Court majority and in at least two areas has overturned longstanding precedent when it comes to reproductive choice. and when it comes to affirmative action. But I would note that that was, in both cases, that was the result of decades-long campaigns by the right to overturn those precedents going back to the 1970s. That is not the case with respect to Plyler. There have been a handful of states, California among them, with Proposition 187 in 1994, but a handful of states that have attempted to implement legislation that would violate Plyler. In every case, the federal courts have immediately struck those efforts down. It is also important to note that since Plyler versus Doe was decided in 1982, it has been incorporated into federal statutory law, creating an additional barrier to any attempts to eliminate or violate Plyler. So Plyler is in no imminent danger, and every child, regardless of immigration status, should continue to attend public school from kindergarten through 12th grade. Indeed, it's important to talk about what Plyler should prevent. Plyler, guaranteeing a right to attend school, should also prevent raids by ICE or individual immigration officers at school sites, at public K-12 school sites. Despite the fact that this administration may eliminate the policy memo about secure locations, that does not mean that they have the right or ability to enter public schools, because doing so in order to engage in immigration enforcement would violate Plyler versus Doe. With respect to higher education, I want to talk briefly about DACA as well. It is important to note that last administration, President Trump attempted to eliminate DACA, and ultimately the Supreme Court stopped him from doing that. Now, the Supreme Court has changed since that decision was made, but it's important to remember that that's what occurred. In addition, eliminating DACA in this administration is already much more difficult than it was in the first Trump administration. That was done through an announcement by the Attorney General to change the policy with respect to DACA that had been adopted by the Obama administration. Since then, the Biden administration has gone through a formal regulatory rulemaking process to implement DACA, to keep it in place. When you have gone through a formal rulemaking process, then eliminating DACA will also require a formal rulemaking process. No announcement from the Attorney General, no announcement from Trump himself would immediately end DACA. Instead, they would have to go through a process, the rulemaking process, of putting their proposal out publicly in the Federal Register, seeking public comment for a reasonable period of time, taking the time to grapple with all of those public comments before they can finalize an elimination of DACA. So it is harder today than it was in the first Trump administration, where, as easy as it formally was to do, the Supreme Court stopped the Trump administration from moving forward. Yes, there is litigation currently against DACA by the state of Texas. It is before the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. MALDEF is there representing intervening DACA recipients. The state of New Jersey has also intervened. So there are folks to defend DACA, even if the main defendant, the United States, changes its position under the Trump administration. It's important to note that this litigation began in 2018 under the previous Trump administration. So the first 2+ years of this litigation went forward without a defense being put up by the United States. The defense was handled entirely by the interveners. This would happen again if Trump was to change the United States' position in that litigation. That litigation could go forward unless and until there is a successful repeal of DACA by the Trump administration through that arduous rulemaking process that I mentioned previously. It's also important to note that so many of the civil rights, basic civil rights that we all count on in education, are protected by congressional legislation. Therefore, in order to eliminate them or limit them would require, again, congressional action. As a previous panelist noted, this is a Congress that, despite Republican formal control, is quite evenly split in the House of Representatives, where it will be difficult for them to enact anything that they cannot achieve unanimous Republican support for. It is also true that the Senate majority is not a filibuster-proof majority. They do not have the votes, even with every Republican aligned, to overrule, to overcome a filibuster. So they would have to change the filibuster rules, which the Democrats attempted but could not do with respect to limited legislation in this last Congress because they could not get 51 votes to change filibuster rules. It is a question, an open question, whether the Republicans could obtain 51 votes to change the filibuster with respect to these very important civil rights issues. So there will be, I guarantee, although we don't know the specifics of the action, we do know there will be a barrage, a daily barrage of rhetoric that is anti-immigrant, that is anti-DEI, that is anti-civil rights, that is anti-public education, a daily barrage of rhetoric. Part of that rhetoric will be overstated powers of the president to do what he wants. In fact, this is, again, a calculated campaign designed to cause folks, including local school district officials, to act on their own in retreating from what is attacked by the president and his cabinet members. But that rhetoric cannot be made real in most cases without congressional action. It is true that he will have control of the Office for Civil Rights in the Department of Education and the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. And so they will do their best to go after progressive initiatives in education and argue that they are a violation of the civil rights of white people. However, they have limited authority outside of court to do anything. The Office for Civil Rights of the Department of Education can threaten federal funding, but it cannot unilaterally withdraw federal funding without going through arduous due process for those who they seek to target for the elimination of federal funding. Similarly, the Department of Justice has to act through the courts. Unless they can secure some sort of settlement, they have to act through the courts, and the courts, despite the presence of a number of Trump-appointed judges that will increase in this administration, the courts remain a protection against precipitous elimination of funding for anyone who is engaged in progressive measures with respect to education. And let me end by saying that, again, the rhetoric will be extreme. They will be attempting to use that rhetoric to convince local decision makers, which, as you heard from the previous panelists, traditionally in K-12 education, local control has been a mantra, especially for Republican leaders from top to bottom. That local control means that they will be attempting to convince local school board members and states to withdraw from DEI, to withdraw from protection of immigrant students, to withdraw from aggressive enforcement of civil rights mandates. But their actual tools to effect that beyond the rhetoric are quite limited without congressional acquiescence. Therefore, it's important for all of us to keep an eye on what's going on in Congress far beyond the rhetoric you hear from the administration, because regardless of his desires to be a dictator, in fact, under our system, the president and his cabinet members do not have dictatorial power. They must follow constitutional mandates like due process. And for many of the changes that they suggest they would like to see implemented, they will have to secure from a fairly evenly split Congress congressional action to implement those.
Thank you, Tom. Someone mentioned in the chat that Trump has now publicly stated he supports DACA. I don't think he said that. I think he said we need to do something about dreamers. I think that's what he said. What do you make of that?
Well, I will note, as I've said to others, that prior to his becoming a politician, Donald Trump did meet with dreamers and express support for them. I would also note that unlike other important announcements during his first administration, he did not go out and announce the end of DACA. He sent then Attorney General Jeff Sessions to go out and make the public announcement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That speaks to me that he was not as committed to that as some of the other things where he would push everyone out of the way to be the public face. What he has said is that he wants Congress to find a solution for this population. Now, that's wise because he should recognize and hopefully is being advised by his economic advisors that removing DACA recipients alone, much less engaging in a broader campaign of mass deportations, would devastate the economy. There's no question. You can't take 500,000 skilled workers, remove them precipitously from the workforce, and not expect an impact on the economy. So hopefully he will be true to that statement and work with Republican congressional leaders to find a solution for DACA recipients who have massive bipartisan support among voters nationwide for their cause. But we don't know, and therefore we have to be prepared for all of the possibilities, including that the administration will attempt through the regulatory process to end DACA, that they will change their position in the litigation. But it's important to note there are still protections on the part of both of those potential steps.
Thank you, Tom. And this question is for both of you who are left in the panel. Mr. Dean Noguera had to leave. One of our reporters posted in the chat that a political article that talks about Trump wanting to build a free online university and make Harvard pay for it. What do you guys make of this idea?
I'll just start by saying
Either Tom.
I take that as like the guarantee that Mexico would pay for a wall. So no power
Yeah.
to make Harvard do that, as far as I am aware. And it's unlikely something that an administration would take on in the middle of seeking to eliminate the Department of Education.
Unless perhaps if the president were able to find a way to monetize it.
Well, he already tried that once.
That was too easy. I'm sorry.
And that's already a bad name. So Trump University probably can't be resurrected, but you're right.
Right. Yeah. Sunita is pointing out in the chat that yes, we are referring to that interview where Trump said, "Oh, we want something for the dreamers, etc." And yeah, already Tom has responded to that. So let's see. In terms of let me see if there's any more questions that we haven't talked about. Okay, Henrietta says here, what happens if a group challenges this law up to the Supreme Court? You're talking to Plyler versus Doe. Can the conservative Supreme Court reverse Plyler or make the law void? Well, I think you already responded to this, Tom, but is it possible at all?
So, of course, it's possible, but there are so many barriers in front of it getting to the Supreme Court that would allow the court to overrule Plyler that I don't see that happening. That's why it's not in any imminent danger. The right-wing forces like the Heritage Foundation don't seem to understand all of the legal barriers in front of implementing a law that violates Plyler. I would also note, nobody actually wants to implement a violation of Plyler. I said this about Governor Abbott in Texas when he threatened this a few years ago. I guarantee you Governor Abbott does not want his supporters to see thousands of students on street corners instead of in schools. He doesn't want that. He knows the calls that he'll get. He knows he'll start to lose support from among those who are his strongest supporters, especially if those students are largely Latino. You can imagine what some of Abbott's supporters would react to seeing thousands of Latino students, some of them middle and high school age, standing on street corners and not in school. He doesn't actually want to implement it. I guarantee you Donald Trump doesn't actually want to implement it. This is all about rhetoric designed to scare people on the one hand and also designed to appeal to some measure of the base of voters who support them.
You said Plyler also covers the protections against conducting raids in K-12 education. What about universities?
Plyler does not apply in universities, but I would note that universities can and should use a constitutional power that they have, academic freedom, to bar raids on their campuses. I said this to them 8 years ago. Academic freedom is the First Amendment right to determine who you teach, how you teach it, what you teach. And certainly, if you've decided to teach students who are immigrants, and you've decided to teach them on campus, you can use the power of academic freedom, in my view, to bar enforcement actions that would disrupt education. So it takes courage on behalf of institutions who do have a duty to protect their students. But there are protections that can be put in place even for university students. Now, you can't protect them necessarily when they're off campus. There are other issues that arise
Right.
then, including issues of rights that they may have. But with respect to a higher education campus, those campus leaders, I believe, have not just the right, but an obligation to protect the decisions that they've made by ensuring that there are not immigration raids on campus.
Mhm. Okay, we have
Pilar,
about
I would add quickly to Tom's comments on K-12 education. While the federal government spends on average across the country about 10% of, or provides about 10% of school district monies, in less affluent school districts, in low-income communities, those percentages can be as high as almost 30%. And so the local school districts and their elected representatives know this, stand to lose a great deal of federal money that is very much part of the engine of their school districts' education programs if large numbers of students were suddenly uh, you know, cut loose, if you will.
okay. Let's wrap up. We have 3 minutes, so for both of you, in terms of this topic, of this issue, what's your biggest concern and what's your biggest source of optimism for both of you?
I'll start. My biggest concern is that rhetoric does have repercussions. People do get scared by rhetoric, even if it's not followed up by action. We certainly saw that under the first Trump administration. So we need to do the best we can to prepare for that very dangerous rhetoric that will characterize this administration from day one: anti-immigrant, anti-DEI, anti-civil rights, anti-public education. Now, my reason for optimism, I will be a little bit flip in saying that he's appointing even less competent people than he did the first time. I'm struggling because in the first Trump administration, I characterized his cabinet as a clown car. And I don't know what's worse than a clown car, because the people he's putting up for this cabinet are even worse. I would have thought it would be impossible to find someone less qualified to lead the Department of Education than Betsy DeVos, but he found her.
I would say that my biggest concern, as I mentioned earlier, and as Pedro suggested, is that the incoming administration is not likely to put enough of its focus, pay enough attention to the large challenge we face in this country of educating millions of students to higher levels than we are now. Our demographics are changing. The nature of work is changing, and we really do need to do better by more students. And I just don't see that as their focus in education. I'm focusing myself in this comment on K-12, but. On the other side of the equation, there have emerged in recent years, in part as sort of silver linings to the pandemic, some very concrete, scalable school improvement strategies, including sort of high quality tutoring in schools that, if done at scale, could really make a difference for a lot of students. And if we could stitch 4 or 5 of those things together, we could really raise the performance level of a lot of schools and help a lot of students.
Well, we've reached the end of the briefing. Thank you, Thomas and Thomas, Tom and Tom, and Pedro Noguera, who already had to leave. He had another meeting, for joining us today and sharing your perspectives with us. And thank you to all the reporters that showed up. And wish you a good weekend.
Thank you very much, Pilar.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.